Joining us to discuss is David Halperin, Executive Director of the Israel Policy Forum. David, thanks for being in studio with us.
Thank you for having me.
David, we saw Shai Ben-Ari's piece detailing these tunnels and how a top Israeli Defense Force official is saying that Hamas's strategic use of tunnels to attack Israel is diminishing. In favor of what? In favor of rockets? What would be the change?
Well, first of all, I think this is certainly great news for those who live in the Gaza border communities. And while it's great news that they're confident that they've addressed that threat from Gaza, there's no question, as was mentioned in the piece, that there's concern that Hamas may attempt to use those tunnels to create attacks before they are no longer available to them. In terms of other sorts of attacks, certainly an increase in rocket attacks is possible, as well as some of the amateurish, if I dare say, efforts that we've seen in the past, whether it be makeshift drone attacks, or even, dare I say, commando-type efforts from the sea that we've seen happen in previous rounds of conflict. And of course, we also may see Hamas, as we saw very recently with the attack in the West Bank, efforts to stoke tensions there.
Well, David, Israel, to tackle the tunnel issue, and has done so rather effectively, has installed this anti-tunnel technology that has underground sensors. It's still being fully implemented. How does that work exactly?
In terms of the exact technological detail, I'm sure that's highly
We don't need to break that down for us.
Again, I think it's important to note that Defense Minister mentioned that it's still about a year away. And so while...
But some parts have already been installed and have proven to be effective, but the entire length of the underground barrier has still to be implemented. That's
correct, and I think it's also notable in your piece the extent to which this has become a priority for the Israeli government, working day and night. And frankly, it's another reason why there is a great deal of interest to ensure that there isn't another round of conflict vis-a-vis Gaza, to enable this tunnel process to be completed, frankly. There is one thing, however, that we should just note, that these tunnels are dealing with the offensive tunnels going from Gaza into Israel. It does not address the tunnel network. I think it's something like 100 kilometers of tunnels that Hamas has throughout the Gaza Strip, in the event of another conflict where you'd have Israeli soldiers entering the Strip, facing this sort of tunnel network that Hamas is using for transporting its soldiers and equipment, etc.
Now, some of these tunnels are estimated to cost between $3 million to $10 million to construct them. Where does that money come from?
Where does that money come from? That money comes from Hamas's donors. I think, you know, when you think about...
When you say Hamas's donors, you mean Iran? Or is this aid that gets misused?
I mean, when you have various businessmen going through the checkpoints with suitcases, frankly, of cash, bringing to Gaza, and of course Hamas taxing its own citizens. I think when you go to Kerem Shalom crossing points and you can see the way in which Israel vets the material that is to be brought in to the Gaza Strip, Hamas often takes much of that material and taxes its own citizens to generate revenue in order to use for these sorts of attacks.
And also some concerns that aid money gets funneled into these projects. So speaking of its own citizens, these tunnels are often built underneath schools, hospitals, homes. Recently, last year in October, there was an incident where a tunnel was discovered underneath a Gaza school run by the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Obviously, this is done to use these people as human shields, to disincentivize Israel from attacking. And if Israel does attack, to create more hatred, more anger when civilians are killed in this process. What do the people in Gaza think about this? The people whose schools and homes are above these tunnels?
I think it's a great question to ask many of those in Gaza. I think that...
Do they know that they're being used this way?
I think they do, but I also think they rally around the flag, essentially. They clearly have a different narrative, a narrative of one of fighting soldiers, their fighting soldiers against Israel and doing their part. I think it's a warped narrative. It's certainly not one with which I agree and find it quite frankly, very disheartening and disgusting. However, the question is both how Hamas is using these the civilian infrastructure to protect themselves, while at the same time not investing in the civilian infrastructure, using those funds for the tunnel networks underneath these infrastructures, rather than investing in the schools in that same area. And it's certainly something of great concern.
Tragic for the children living there. David Halperin, Executive Director at the Israel Policy Forum. Thank you.
Thank you.